Hi, Carter. We're going to start with chapter 13 today from the Green Embers, and the chapter is called Boat Answers. Heather could tell the sun was high in the sky even before she opened her eyes. She lay still, trying to remember where she was and why she was hurting all over. Then it all came back to her. The storm, Lady Glen, the terrible fire, the wolves, her family killed or captured, and the wild flight to escape from Red-Eye Garlickson and his horrible band. So much had happened. She felt the gently bobbing rhythm of the river as they continued to drift down it on the old boat. She felt Pickle's presence beside her. Judging by the sound of snoring in her ear, he was sleeping deeply. At least they hadn't changed. She didn't want to disturb him, so she lay still a little longer. She opened her eyes for a moment and saw that Smalls was awake, huddled with Uncle Wilfred at the prow of the boat, their backs to her and Pickett. As Uncle Wilfred shifted to look back at them, she closed her eyes. She wasn't even sure why she did it. She just did. The two of them were talking. She felt like it was wrong to eavesdrop on the two who had been so kind to her, but now she wasn't sure what else to do. "I think we should make for Cloud Mountain," Uncle Wilfred whispered. "Wait it out a little longer." "That's what they want," Small said, anger just touching his words. "That's what they'll expect, for us to go to cover, to hide somewhere, which is why I say we don't do it. What if we head straight for First Warren?" "Hey, Carter, a warren is what you call a cluster of rabbits where they make their home together." "First Warren," Uncle Wilfred said wearily. "I don't like it. It would be so dangerous. Even if we somehow got in, they won't listen to us anymore. Winslow as good as banished us. Morbin's been in his ear too long. And anyway, what about these two?" "Could we set them up somewhere they can get up the mountain? Wouldn't Tommy Decker take them up?" Smalls said. Heather could feel their eyes on her, and she tried to breathe easy and not move. Pickett's sometimes raucous snoring snores made it hard to hear. "We could leave them now at Decker's and go on," Uncle Wilfred said. "But nowhere's really safe if Morbin's willing to send wolves this far out. I think we'd best to go up ourselves. There will be a Congress soon, and we should be there. Anyway, this is my family, these two. I think we'd all be better off to go right on up." "Well, maybe you're safe. I want them safe, Wilfred," Small said. There was heaviness in his words. "I really do. But I think we have more than just them to think of." "I know," said Uncle Wilfred. Heather squinted and saw that Uncle Wilfred had his hand on Small's back. "You know I'm on—" But he stopped talking when Pickett snorted, stirred, then yawned loudly. Heather was irritated. She wanted to hear more. Pickett sat up stretching, and Heather did the same. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Small said. "I was already awake," Pickett said, rubbing his eyes and looking around confused. Heather shook her head. "Of course you were." "Good morning, shipmates," Uncle Wilfred said. "You're true sailors now, having spent a night on the water and under the stars." "Yeah, add that to our list of firsts," Heather said, smiling weakly. Small smiled back at her. "You were amazing yesterday, Heather." He said, "I'm Smalls. I'm so glad to finally meet you," when they shook hands. She laughed. "My pleasure to meet you, Smalls. How's your head?" "Well, nothing life-threatening," he said. "I've had worse." "Thanks for rescuing me," said Heather. "I would have been finished for sure without you. And you too, Uncle." "Pickett was brave as well," said Uncle Wilfred. Pickett didn't believe he'd been very brave. He believed he'd been saved, had stood by his sister as his sister had been saved, and then had been lucky to be saved again. He was losing count of how many times he had failed and needed rescuing. He saw baby Jax in his mind's eyes and squinted against his rush of tears. He shook his head. "You were brave, Pickett," Heather said. "Of course," Small said, laughing and turning to him. Small slid over and slapped him on the back. Pickett pitched forward a bit, but rebalanced quickly, looking sideways back and forth. "You," Small said, pointing at him, "are my favorite mathematician. Well, I'd love to see you as an engineer, building things, solving problems." Pickett frowned. The dislike for Smalls he had felt when they first met was creeping back. Little things about the white rabbit irritated him. His fancy black scarf, the plain sword at his side, his strength. Why these things should bother him he couldn't say, but they just did. Pickett imagined himself like a magnet and Smalls like another magnet, turned the wrong way. He looked at Smalls for a moment, then looked down and said quietly, "Thank you, Smalls. You saved Heather when I let her down, and I'll never forget that." "Come on, Pickett," Wilfred said. "You never let anyone down. We all did what we could yesterday, and it turned out all right." Pickett wanted to argue, but he kept quiet. For the next few minutes, Uncle Wilfred looked them each over, consulted his little book, and offered advice or encouragement about their many pains and wounds. He had clearly been around wounds of many kinds and was not alarmed by anything. "You both should be fine with some rest and food," he pronounced, smiling at them. How much he looked like Father. It was comforting and sad. Pain settled down deeply in Pickett. Since the disaster of yesterday morning, everything he saw and heard felt like another chapter in an awful story of pain. "I'm so sorry about your ear, Heather," Uncle Wilfred said, taking a small strip torn from a cloth in his bag to bind up the split ear together. "It's not anything that'll hurt your hearing, but I'm afraid it might always be like that." She smiled, but her eyes unfocused for a moment and she winced. Pickett saw she was remembering something terrifying. So much pain. "It could have been worse," she said. "It's a marked distinction," said Smalls. "It's in no way diminishing your beauty." Pickett bristled. "Uncle Wilfred," Heather said quickly, "where have you come from? How did you know we were in trouble? Why have we never met you?" "Heather, dear," he said, "I know you have these and more questions. You're far too clever to be satisfied with ignorance." "I like that." He grinned at his niece. "But we really need to get some food and rest. How about I give you the quick and almost totally unsatisfactory version?" "Fine," she said. Pickett realized he was starving. "We're just about a mile from Decker's Landing," said Uncle Wilfred. "It's run by my old friend, Tommy Decker. We'll see if he's got food for us. Later we can talk more." "Thanks, Uncle," said Heather. "I don't know where we'd be without you and Smalls." "Don't mention it, dear," he said, smiling down at her. "I'll paddle," said Smalls, hopping to the oars with unexpected energy. He displayed his surprising strength as the boat shot forward. Pickett sniffed. Well, well," Uncle Wilfred began, "where should we start?" "Why not tell us where you and Smalls met?" Pickett asked. "Pickett," Heather said, "can't you tell that Smalls is Uncle Wilfred's son? He's our cousin." At this, Smalls faltered at the oars. Uncle Wilfred stammered a moment and then said, "Well, my dear niece and nephew, Smalls isn't—" "I'm not his real son," said Smalls. "He adopted me." Uncle Wilfred paused. "Right. So you don't have a wife and kids?" Pickett asked. "Shh," said Heather. "Let him talk, Pickett." "No, Pickett, I don't have a family anymore." There were a few moments when no one spoke, and the splashing of the oars was the only sound. Smalls worked on his black scarf trailing in the breeze. "Uncle," said Heather, "what can we do to get Father and Mother and Jax back? If they're still, if they're all right." Pickett sat up and clenched his fist. "I'm sorry, dear, we can do nothing at present," he said. "We'll alert those who need to know, but I'm sorry to say that they're probably gone for now, and probably forever." Pickett's insides churned. He leaned over the side and was sick. He looked back to see Heather hang her head and cry. Pickett closed his eyes, gasping. He saw a vision of Jax looking up at him with unbelievable sadness, asking over and over, "Where are you?" A long silence followed. The only sounds to be heard were the plunge and splash of angry strokes as Smalls tore up at the water. "They'll be taken to the Great Wood, or worse," said Smalls. "What's so bad about the Great Wood?" asked Heather. "It's a ruin, Heather, and the crumbled wreck is ruled by pathetic puppets. Smalls and I came from the Great Wood. We were on our way to see you. I hadn't seen my brother for a long time and hadn't seen you, Heather, since you were a baby." "You've seen me before?" asked Heather. "Oh, yes, I've seen you, but never Pickett. Your parents are very dear to me, but I had work to do, and when you were born, they decided to leave, along with most families who could." "We're coming up on Slender Bend in a few minutes," said Smalls. Pickett looked ahead at the bending river, then up and away to the right. He noticed how much scenery had changed from when they sped away from Nicolo the prior day. There were high hills rising in the distance, the highest tinged with mist. Good, said Uncle Wilfred. Up around this bend, our friend Decker has a home in the Whitmer. He's been there for years, gardening and living his own way. He was just like your parents. He left the great wood for the safety of the wider world. Of course, it used to be reversed. Free rabbits never would have thought of leaving the great wood for safety elsewhere. They would flock there for protection. But now you've left the great wood too, Pickett said. Why? Well, things had got so bad we had to get out as well, he said. I'm sorry, said Heather, as much to Smalls as to Uncle Wilfred. We didn't know about the wolves at first, said Uncle Wilfred. We were away up north of Nick Hollow for a little while, but when we came south, we saw signs of trouble. We made good time trying to get to your home, but we were too late. When we arrived, the elm was burning, and we know there were too many enemies to attempt a rescue. You saw Mother and Father? Asked Heather. And the baby. Uncle Wilfred nodded sadly. Jack, said Pickett, how were they? They were hurt, he said. I won't lie. Your father looked bad. Pickett's head drooped and he sniffed and said, I'm sure he kept fighting until they made him stop. I think so, said Uncle. That would be like him, but they were still alive. At least they were then. After a few moments of silence, Small said, nearly to Slender Bend. What will we do? Heather asked when they saw the river begin to shrink. I'm not sure. Pickett shook his head. I can't believe they've been taken. Get used to it, lad, said Smalls. I'm not your lad, Pickett spat, anger and resentment boiling over. Sorry if I'm upset. We just lost our family. Smalls laughed bitterly and shook his head. Pickett, don't. Uncle Wilfred began, but his pain was rising inside him like vomit, and his sword-bearing, scarf-wearing little rabbit was going to hear it. Well, how would you know, Pickett shouted, how it feels to lose you love the most? I'm sick of your charming, stuck-up attitude and your lad this and your lad that. I'm not a kid. I don't need permission from you to think or talk. I don't like you. I don't want to hear you talking to me again like I'm a little child. Uncle Wilfred made to speak again, but Smalls shook his head. He stopped rowing for a moment as the river narrowed around him. He turned to look at Pickett, and there were tears in his eyes. Pickett, he said quietly, stay angry. It's okay if it's at me for now. If you're not angry about the wicked things happening all around, then you don't have a soul. There was silence as they rounded the curve of Slender Bend. Then Heather screamed. Everyone looked ahead. Decker's Landing was on fire. I'll read you another one tomorrow. I love you, Carter.